The road to Hollow Oak was not meant to be traveled at night. The asphalt had surrendered to dirt miles ago, and the tall, ancient pines pressed in from both sides, blotting out the stars. Liam kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes tracking the weak beams of his headlights. He had bought this cabin online, a secluded haven where he could escape the relentless noise of the city, where he could finally write. But as the towering branches closed over his car like a heavy, dark canopy, he felt less like a guest and more like an intruder. He parked outside the small, rustic cabin. The wood was weathered, stained a deep charcoal by decades of mountain rain. When he stepped out, the air was cold enough to bite his lungs, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Inside, the cabin was small and cozy, boasting a stone fireplace and dark oak floors. Liam built a fire, listening to the wood snap and hiss. The warmth was comforting, yet the quiet of the forest was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence that pressed against his ears. He sat down with his leather-bound journal, trying to write. But every time he dipped his pen, his eyes wandered back to the dark window pane, staring into the black void of the woods. It was exactly 2:05 a.m. when the sound began. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of the old wooden floorboards. It was a deliberate, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Liam froze. The sound came from the exterior wooden wall of the cabin, right behind the chair where he sat. It sounded like fingernails gently rapping against the solid log. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He approached the window and wiped away the condensation. Outside, there was only darkness and the endless rows of pine trees swaying in the wind. He opened the front door, the cold air rushing in. "Hello," he called out, his voice swallowed by the shadows. No one answered. He shone his flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but mossy trunks and wet leaves. He closed the door and locked it. As he walked back to the fireplace, he noticed something on the wooden wall outside the window. He peered closer. There were faint, wet marks on the glass. 3 curved lines, like the tips of long, damp fingers that had slid down the pane. He shivered, pulling his blanket tighter. The next morning, the sun brought a false sense of security. Eager to clear his mind, Liam took a walk down the narrow forest path. The air was crisp, but the silence remained unsettling. No birds sang, and no small animals scurried through the brush. After walking for a mile, he saw a figure standing near an old, decayed oak tree. It was an elderly man dressed in a faded, oil-stained coat. He carried a rusty axe over his shoulder. Liam approached him, feeling a wave of relief. "Excuse me, sir. Do you live nearby?" Liam asked. The old man didn't move. He simply turned his head, staring at Liam with cloudy, pale eyes. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the cabin behind Liam. Then he shook his head slowly, waving his index finger in a clear no. He placed a finger to his lips, making a silent, should gesture, and then pointed up toward the towering pine trees. Before Liam could ask another question, the old man turned and walked slowly into the thick brush, disappearing as if he were a part of the fog itself. Liam stood alone, the chill of the woods settling deep into his bones. By nightfall, the fog had returned, thicker than before, rolling in like a slow wave of white smoke. Inside the cabin, Liam felt trapped. Every crack of the timber, every gust of wind felt amplified. He tried to read, but the words blurred. Then, at exactly 2:05 a.m., the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it was followed by a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a whisper. It was soft, like dry leaves rubbing together, yet it sounded distinctly like his name. Lee. Lee. The voice seemed to come from the very logs of the cabin. Liam grabbed his iron fire poker, his knuckles white. "Who's there?" "I have a weapon." "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The whispering stopped. The quiet returned, heavier than before. He stood in the center of the room, holding his breath, waiting. He realized then that the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was as if the forest was breathing through the walls, trying to coax him out or invite itself in. Suddenly, the power went out. The warm glow of the lamps died instantly, leaving only the dying embers of the fireplace. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, and Liam could see his breath in the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was no longer on the wall. It was coming from the floorboards, right below his feet. Liam jumped onto his bed, drawing his knees to his chest. He turned on his phone's flashlight, scanning the floor. The wooden planks seemed to groan under some unseen weight. The W. Determined to find answers, Park Ranger David stepped outside to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. The damp, mossy soil behind the structure held a dark secret. He found a pair of bare footprints. Strangely, the tracks did not lead deeper into the woods. They simply stopped. It was as if Liam had stood in one spot and vanished directly into the earth. Right where the footprints ended, a thick, gnarled root of an ancient pine tree had broken through the surface, coiled like a sleeping serpent. As David followed the root's path into the trees, a figure materialized from the dense, creeping fog. It was the elderly woodsman, his pale, cloudy eyes staring blankly. Before David could ask anything, the old man slowly raised his trembling hand and pointed his index finger toward the darkest, most overgrown part of the forest, a place where the canopy was so thick that sunlight never touched the ground. The old man leaned in and whispered, "The roots are hungry. They rage when you speak, and they swallow when you are silent." Before David could respond, the man stepped backward into the fog and vanished. Unnerved, David returned to the cabin to search for more clues. On the table, he found Liam's leather-bound journal. The last page, written in frantic, shaky handwriting, read, "They are calling from beneath. This forest is alive. Each tree is a tomb, holding those who came before. The roots drink the blood, and the branches claim the flesh. Tonight, they are coming for me." As night fell, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, trapping David inside. At exactly 2:05 a.m., the generator failed, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. The temperature dropped instantly, turning David's breath into white mist. Then, the tapping returned. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it wasn't on the walls. It was directly beneath his boots, coming from the floorboards. The wooden planks began to groan and splinter as thick, black roots forced their way up through the floor. From every corner of the dark room, a chorus of dry, leafy whispers echoed, calling David's name. He switched on his flashlight, only to freeze in sheer terror. The roots were moving like living serpents, wrapping tightly around his ankles. He pulled and struggled, but the grip was absolute, dragging him downward into the cold, damp earth beneath the cabin. His screams were quickly muffled by the soil, swallowed by the absolute silence of the forest. The next morning, the sun rose over Hollow Oak, but no birds sang. The cabin door swayed quietly in the wind. Just outside the front porch, a new pine sapling had sprouted from the dark earth, its young branches reaching upward like the desperate, clutching fingers of a hand. The disappearance of Ranger David sent shockwaves through the local department, but to the residents of the nearby town of Oak Haven, it was simply another silent confirmation of the curse they all whispered about in secret. The files were quickly labeled as unresolved missing persons cases, and the road to Hollow Oak was officially barricaded, marked with rusted signs warning travelers to turn back. But warnings have a way of acting as invitations for those who seek the truth. Enter Dr. Arthur Vance, a senior botanist and professor of dendrochronology, and Clara, Liam's younger sister. Clara refused to believe that her brother had simply walked into the woods and vanished without a trace. She had listened to the copy of the audio recording Liam's wife had received from the police, and she knew there was something far more sinister at work. Armed with Arthur's scientific equipment, Liam's old notes, and an unyielding desperation, they bypassed the barricades on a gray, overcast morning, determined to uncover what the forest of Hollow Oak was hiding. As they crossed the threshold where the asphalt surrendered to the dirt road, the temperature took a sudden, unnatural plunge. The air grew heavy, smelling of rotting wood and wet iron. The towering pines seemed to lean inward, their dark, overlapping branches weaving a tight canopy that choked out the daylight, leaving the forest in a perpetual, gloomy twilight. "The trees here," Arthur whispered, stopping to touch the bark of a massive pine. "They're growth rings. If my initial satellite scans are correct, these trees aren't growing outward. They're drawing nutrients in a way that defies known biology. It's almost as if they are feeding on a highly concentrated organic source beneath the soil." Clara didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead. Through the thick mist, the outline of the cabin emerged. The cabin looked smaller than it had in Liam's photographs, weathered and beaten down by the elements, looking less like a shelter and more like a decaying tooth jutting out of the earth. They stepped onto the porch. The wooden planks groaned in protest. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying back and forth with a slow, rhythmic creak that sounded like a dying breath. Clara pushed it open, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick layer of dust and shadow inside. The interior was exactly as Liam and David had left it. The cold, dead fireplace was filled with gray ash. Liam's leather-bound journal was gone, taken by David before his disappearance, but the voice recorder sat on the table, its battery long dead. Arthur immediately set up his equipment on the wooden table. He unpacked a soil core sampler, thermal imaging cameras, and a specialized biofrequency monitor designed to detect the low-frequency electrical signals that plants use to communicate. "We need to work fast," Arthur said, his voice tense. "The atmospheric pressure is dropping rapidly, and the fog is thickening. We don't want to be here when night falls." Clara walked over to the spot where David's footprints had reportedly ended. She knelt, brushing away a layer of dead pine needles. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Pushing up through the floorboards was a thick, dark root, coiled tightly like a sleeping serpent. When she touched it, she gasped and pulled her hand back. "Arthur, it's warm," she whispered. Arthur hurried over, placing his hand on the bark. His eyes widened. "That's impossible. Plants don't regulate internal temperature. But this has a thermal signature of nearly 98 degrees. It's mimicking human body heat." Suddenly, the biofrequency monitor on the table began to static. A low, rhythmic hum filled the small cabin. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a sound from the air. It was a vibration rising through the floorboards. A slow, steady heartbeat deep within the earth of Hollow Oak. By late afternoon, the fog had completely swallowed the cabin, turning the world outside the windows into a wall of seamless, blinding white. Arthur was glued to his monitor, watching the readouts spike into chaotic, jagged lines. "The electrical activity in these roots is off the charts," Arthur muttered, running his hand through his gray hair. "It's not random. It's a network. The entire forest is connected, Clara. Thousands of trees, miles of roots, all acting as a single, massive neural pathway. They aren't just plants. They are a collective intelligence. But what do they want?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she stared out the window. "What did they do to Liam?" "To David. They feed," a dry, raspy voice answered from the doorway. Clara and Arthur spun around, their flashlights illuminating the open doorway. Standing on the threshold was the elderly woodsman. His faded, oil-stained coat was damp with mist, and his cloudy, pale eyes seemed to look right through them. He carried no axe this time, his hands hanging limp at his sides. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, taking a step back. "Did you see my brother?" The old man stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a sudden, violent force. Neither Clara nor Arthur had seen him touch it. "Your brother spoke to them," the old man said, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping against stone. "He brought his words, his thoughts, his fears into their domain. The roots do not tolerate noise. They crave the silence of the earth. When you speak, you give them a map to your mind. They find your fears, they mimic your loved ones, and then they invite you to sleep." "This is madness," Arthur stammered, though his eyes were locked on his monitor, which was now translating the forest's biofrequencies into a chaotic mess of sound that sounded dangerously like distorted human voices. "The forest was here long before the town, long before the roads," the old man continued, his gaze drifting to the floorboards. "It is a graveyard that buries itself. Every tree you see out there is a monument to someone who dared to speak in the dark. I was the keeper once. I kept the silence. But I failed. And now the soil is hungry again. Where is Liam? Clara cried out, tears spilling down her cheeks. Just tell me where he is. The old man slowly raised a trembling, dirt-caked finger and pointed straight down, through the floorboards, into the black, suffocating depths of the earth. He is listening, the old man whispered. And now they know you are here. Before Clara could ask another question, the old man collapsed. His body didn't hit the floor with a heavy thud. Instead, his clothes fell empty to the ground. Inside the oil-stained coat, there was nothing but a hollow mass of dry pine needles and decaying roots that rapidly crumbled into dust. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. 1:58 a.m., 2:01 a.m., 2:04 a.m. With a sudden, violent screech, the power grid they had brought failed. The generator outside died, and the warm lights of their equipment vanished, leaving only the weak, flickering beams of their handheld flashlights. The temperature inside plummeted so fast that their breath formed thick, icy clouds in the air. And then it began. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't on the walls. It wasn't on the windows. It was coming from everywhere. Hundreds of tiny, rhythmic taps echoing from the ceiling, the logs, the floorboards, and the ground outside. CLA-RA. CLA-RA. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, muffled, yet completely distinct. It was Liam's voice. Liam, she screamed, rushing toward the window. Clara, don't. Arthur yelled, grabbing her arm. Look at the monitor. It's a trick. The frequency is being projected by the root system. It's mimicking his vocal patterns to draw you out. It's so quiet down here, Clara. The voice whispered, seemingly rising directly from the floorboards beneath her feet. The soil is warm. Come join the roots. Come sleep. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath Arthur's equipment splintered with a deafening crack. A massive, black root, thick as a man's torso and covered in sharp, thorn-like bark, burst through the wood. It lashed out, striking Arthur's desk and sending his expensive monitors crashing to the ground. We have to go. No! Arthur screamed, pulling Clara toward the door. But as they reached the entrance, the door wouldn't budge. Thick, rope-like roots had grown over the exterior frame in a matter of minutes, sealing them inside. Tap, tap, tap. More roots broke through the floor, their wet, glistening surfaces writhing like nests of snakes. Clara kicked wildly as a thin tendril wrapped around her ankle,